Hi there, and welcome to The Daily Gardener, a podcast about gardening, botanical history, and literature. I'm your host, Jennifer Ebling, and today is May 11th, and there are just 40 days until the first day of summer. Today we celebrate a Swiss philosopher who loved nature, and we'll remember the famous Panama orchid hunter whose orchids were displayed on this day 93 years ago. We'll learn about a fascinating discovery by a botanist who was exploring Death Valley last year, and we'll hear a thought-provoking excerpt about pruning as a metaphor for life. We grow that garden library today with a book about mycelium, a network of fine white filaments that are beneath our feet. And then we'll wrap things up with a beautiful museum and garden that opened on this day in 1985. But first, here's today's curated news. Today's curated news comes to us from Grünes Blut. This is a German publication, and the article was written by Anke Schmitz. It's a profile of the gardener Cassian Schmidt, no relation. And Anke introduces us to Cassian this way. Cassian Schmidt may well be called the leader of the new German style. The perennial gardener and landscape architect has been professor of planting design at Geisenheim University of Applied Sciences since 2010 and has been managing the highly regarded Hermannshof perennial and display garden in Weinheim for 23 years. Back in December of 2020, Anke met Cassian in his office at the Hermannshof Gardener's House for an interview. Now, one of the parts of this interview that I think is really fascinating is where Cassian talks about using the principles of plant sociology. And he talks about this as a primarily German phenomenon. He says he includes aspects of coexistence, dynamics, and random changes much more strongly in his considerations than other designers. And this whole topic of phytosociology as a basis for planting design really hadn't been adopted by designers in other countries until recently. Cassian said you have designers like Tom Stewart Smith, Sarah Price, and Dan Pearson who are all helping to lead the change when it comes to plant sociology being incorporated into garden design. He also talks about how important it is to go and tour gardens in other parts of the world. Cassian says, I never would have had the many insights and aha experiences about plants without my travels. And that's a great reminder to all of us, especially after living a year in lockdown alone with our own gardens. If you get a chance this year and can go tour other gardens, definitely do that for your own development and for the development of your garden. Now, another tip that Cassian shares, and I think it's genius, is actually narrowing his pathways. Now, the reason that Cassian likes to do this is he says, I like to use narrow paths where visitors come into contact with the plants. And in this way, they're forced to spend more time in the planting to notice details instead of simply walking past a lot of things. So if you have that situation in your garden where you want to slow your visitors down and make them feel like they're actually part of the landscape, think about incorporating narrowness into your paths at that particular point in the garden. Now, if you've ever hosted a garden tour, you know exactly what I'm talking about. We all have these favorite areas in our garden, and if you have a garden tour, you are keenly aware of the areas where visitors stop and areas where your guests walk through. And if you feel like those special areas are not getting noticed, that may be the perfect spot to narrow a path. Well, let me just wrap this up by saying that Cassian shares a ton of tips. This is a very long format interview, and it is loaded with garden design tips from a true pioneer in garden design, a garden expert, Cassian Schmidt. And you can read this article for yourself over in the Facebook group for the show. Just head on up to the very top where the little magnifying glass is and type in the word Cassian, Cassian, and then this interview will pop up and you can read it to your heart's delight. Now, if you're not in the Facebook group for the show, don't worry. You have a standing invitation. You can join at any time. It's completely free. And then you'll be able to connect with other listeners of the show, share your garden, read the curated news articles, and interact with other people who share your passion for the garden. Now, to join the group, just head on up to the search bar in Facebook where you would search for a friend and type in the words Daily Gardener Community and then request to join. I'd love to meet you in the group. It's time for today's Botanical History. Here's Botanical History for today, May 11th. Today is the anniversary of the death of the Swiss moral philosopher, poet, critic, and nature lover, Henri Frederic Amiel, who died on this day, May 11th, in 1881. Henri used the garden as a metaphor for life. He wrote, "Before my history can teach anybody anything, or even interest myself, it must be disentangled from its materials, distilled and simplified. These thousands of pages are but the pile of leaves and bark from which the essence has still to be extracted. A whole forest of cinchonas are worth but one cask of quinine, and a whole Smyrna rose garden goes to produce one vial of perfume." Henri also recognized the healing power of nature. On June 3rd, 1849, he wrote, "Come, kind nature, smile and enchant me. Veil from me a while my own griefs and those of others. Let me see only the folds of thy queenly mantle, and hide all miserable and ignoble things from me under thy bounties and splendors." On April 29th, 1852, Henri wrote about his spring garden. He said, "I went out into the garden to see what progress the spring was making. I strolled from the irises to the lilacs, round the flower beds, and in the shrubberies." Reverie is the Sunday of thought. It's like a bath which gives vigor and suppleness to the mind as to the body, the banquet of the butterfly wandering from flower to flower over the hills and in the fields. And remember, the soul too is a butterfly. And also, in this passage, Henri famously advised, "A modest garden contains, for those who know how to look and to wait, more instruction than a library." And it was on this day, May 11th, in 1928, that Abel Aken Hunter shared some of his orchid collection at the 3rd Annual National Orchid Show held at Madison Square Garden. The Brooklyn Daily Eagle reported, "A mile of orchids representing every known variety and worth more than $1 million may be seen in the exhibit." Abel Aken Hunter's entry was specifically mentioned as another extraordinary collection brought from the jungles of Central America by A. Hunter of Balboa, Panama. In a biography of Abel's older brother, it was mentioned that all the kids in the Hunter family were, quote, born naturalists, for they knew all the birds and many of the plants and insects found around Lincoln, Nebraska. Incidentally, Abel studied botany at the University of Nebraska, and like many botanists of his time, he fit his passion for botany around his career. He'd been working for the United States Postal Service since he was 15 years old, and Abel's 30-year post office career facilitated his collecting efforts all through his life. In 1906, Abel transferred to the post office in the Canal Zone in Panama. The move was perfect for Abel. His pay jumped to $1,250 a month, and he was smack dab in the middle of a botanical paradise. The year 1910 brought a faithful friend to Abel, the amateur horticulturist and nurse Charles Powell. And although Charles was 2 decades older than Abel, the two men got on famously. In addition to their love of botany, they shared a passion for fishing. Once while they were fishing, they spied an incredible sight. Abel is recorded as saying, "Look, Powell, orchids, oodles of orchids, treefuls of orchids. Let's go get some of them." That day, they brought home a boatload of orchids, and the orchids made their way to collectors across the globe. A few years later, after the canal work was wrapped up, both Abel and Charles transferred to Balboa. In Balboa, Abel and Charles coordinated their vacation requests to accommodate their botanizing trips in Panama. And in the meantime, Charles created a special relationship with the Missouri Botanical Garden, and he sent them 7,000 plants. In return, the Missouri Botanical Garden established a tropical station at Balboa, and Charles Powell served as its first director. Abel succeeded him, and during their tenure, the station became a jewel in the crown of the Missouri Botanical Garden. By the mid-1920s, Abel was collecting with Missouri Botanical Garden experts like George Harry Pring, who recalled, "To obtain new species, it's necessary to climb through the barrancas, or steep rocky slopes, ford streams, cut one's way through the jungle, and hunt for the coveted orchid. And it is truly a hunt." Abel's sharp eyes detected almost everything within range. A week before Thanksgiving, in 1934, the director of the Missouri Botanic Garden sent a party of 3 researchers, including Paul Allen, down to work with Abel. And their primary mission was to find where the Sobralia paulii orchid originated. Abel's gut told him it would be near the headwaters of the river that they were exploring. For 3 days, they made their way through rapids and a tropical rainstorm. Nothing went their way, and they were ready to give up. As they were standing at the edge of a natural pool near the crater of an ancient volcano, Paul decided to jump in for a swim. As he climbed out, Paul's journal records this fantastical moment. Climbing out of the pool on the opposite side, my astonished gaze was met by a plant with great milky white buds nearly ready to open. The long-sought prize, Sobralia paulii, had been found. Its native home was no longer a mystery. Paul Allen called this area a garden of orchids, and would not disclose the exact location. Abel and Paul found hundreds of small orchids in this spot, and incredibly, many were even new to Abel. It was a veritable orchid treasure trove. This trip was everything to Abel. He'd been diagnosed with intestinal cancer, and it would be his final orchid hunt. When it was clear he could not go on, Paul brought Abel to a hospital in Panama City, where he died on April 6th, 1935. After his death, Abel's wife, Mary, operated the station at Balboa for 18 months until, fittingly, Paul Allen was appointed director. Paul Allen traveled to Balboa with his new bride, Dorothy. They had been married for 10 days. As for Abel Aken Hunter, many orchids have been named in his honor, including the Coryanthes hunteranum, or the golden bucket orchid. And it was on this day, May 11th, last year in 2020, that a botanist discovered the wreckage of a CIA plane that crashed in January of 1952 in Death Valley. The botanist was filming his hike in the valley, sharing the various specimens he encountered. It's a fascinating little film, and I shared it in the Facebook group for the show if you'd like to check it out. In the film, the plane is initially seen in the distance. It's only after the botanist reaches the wreckage that the story of the plane becomes clear. AirLive.com reported that it turned out the plane has been there for 68 years. In January of 1952, the SA-16 Albatross was flying from Idaho to San Diego, supporting classified CIA Cold War operations, when its left engine caught fire over Death Valley, California, and the plane began losing altitude and velocity. The pilot gave the order to evacuate the plane, and all 6 people on board jumped out the back door. They parachuted and safely landed 14 miles north of Furnace Creek, which they then hiked to. And I tell you what, if you get a chance to watch that video, you'll really appreciate the terrain that they would have had to walk across in order to reach civilization. It's time for today's Unearthed Words. Today's Unearthed Words are from the author Gary Thorpe. This is an excerpt from his book, Sweeping Changes, Discovering the Joy of Zen in Everyday Tasks. Whether working in the yard or just going about the daily business of life, you are continually adjusting, trimming, touching, shaping, and tinkering with the wealth of things around you. It may be difficult for you to know when to stop. We are all torn between the extremes of taking care of things and leaving them alone, and we question whether many things could ever get along without us. We find ourselves with pruning shears in hand, snipping away at this or that, telling ourselves that we're only being helpful, redefining something, removing that which is unappealing to us. It's not that we really want to change the world. We just want to fix it up slightly. We'd like to lose a few pounds or rid ourselves of some small habit. Maybe we'd like to help a friend improve his situation or repair a few loose ends in the lives of our children. All of this shaping and controlling can have an adverse effect. Unlike someone skilled in the art of bonsai gardening, we may unintentionally stunt much natural growth before it occurs, and our meddling may not be appreciated by others. Most things will get along superbly without our editing, fussing, and intervention. We can learn to just let them be. As a poem of long ago puts it, in the landscape of spring, the flowering branches grow naturally. Some are long, some are short. It's time to grow that garden library with today's book, Mycelium Running by Paul Stamets. This book came out in 2005, and the subtitle is How Mushrooms Can Help Save the World. In this book, Paul shares the power of mushrooms and how growing mushrooms is the best way to save the environment. As Paul explains, the basic science goes like this. Microscopic cells called mycelium, the fruit of which are mushrooms, recycle carbon, nitrogen, and other essential elements as they break down plant and animal debris in the creation of rich new soil. And Paul is passionate about using mycelium to tackle everything from toxic wastes, pollutants, silt in stream beds, pathogens in watersheds, pest control, and general forest and garden health. This book is 356 pages of myco-restoration using mycelium and mushrooms for restoration and environmental health. You can get a copy of Mycelium Running by Paul Stamets and support the show using the Amazon link in today's show notes for around $18. Finally, here's something sweet to revive the little botanic spark in your heart. It was on this day, May 11th in 1985, that the Isamu Noguchi Garden Museum in Long Island City, Queens, officially opened to the public. It was the first American museum established by a living artist for the display of his own work. A modernist sculptor and designer, Isamu founded and designed the museum in a repurposed 1920s red brick industrial building. The two-story museum contains approximately 27,000 square feet of exhibition space and includes a sculpture garden. And in addition to walking through it in person, the beautiful Zen garden can also be spied from the staircase exit on the second floor. It was the Japanese-American artist Isamu Noguchi who said, "When the time came for me to work with larger spaces, I conceived them as gardens, not as sites with objects, but as relationships to a whole." And Isamu also said, "The art of stone in a Japanese garden is that of placement. Its ideal does not deviate from that of nature." And he also had two other sayings that can be applied to the work of garden designers. He said, "When an artist stops being a child, he stops being an artist." And he also said, "We are a landscape of all we have seen." Thanks for listening to The Daily Gardener. And remember, for a happy, healthy life, garden every day. The Daily Gardener is produced in lovely Maple Grove and Wyoming, Minnesota. If you want to read today's show notes, just head on over to thedailygardener.org. And while you're there, be sure to sign up for my free Friday newsletter. And don't forget that you have a standing invitation to join the free Facebook group for listeners of the show. Just search for Daily Gardener Community the next time you're on Facebook and request to join. Last but not least, you can always get in touch by emailing me at jennifer@thedailygardener.org. I'm your host, Jennifer Ebling, and as always, have a great day in the garden, and we'll see you tomorrow.